Good morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Corey Zoli, Director of Research at INSCIT, the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism. We're a joint advanced program shared between the Maxwell School of Public Policy and Syracuse University College of Law. I'm delighted to introduce a former student of mine, Mike Newell, this morning, and his paper, The Origins of American Counterterrorism. Mike is a Ph.D. student in political science in Maxwell, and he's currently doing work on the history of counterterrorism in the 19th and 20th centuries in the American historical context. I believe this paper takes off on some of that broader research. Am I correct about that? And so I want to also mention that this research is generously supported, and this presentation is generously supported by the Andrew Berlin National Security Research Fund. Andrew Berlin himself is a former Maxwell student of Professor Bennett, who I think now is retired, is that correct? Who is a pretty well-known professor of history. So without further ado, we have about 40 minutes for your talk, if that seems okay for you.
I think so.
And then that leaves us, we have this room for an hour, so that leaves us with about 15 minutes or 20 minutes for Q&A, which may be as valuable to you as well. So let's work on that format, and welcome.
All right, thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to the Institute for National Security and Counterterrorism, both for supporting my research and scheduling this talk, and also thanks to Andrew Berlin for the Berlin Family Fund and the support they've given me for the past 2 years. So I'm Michael Newell. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science. And this project is The Origins of American Counterterrorism, though I am considering renaming it to The Logic of Exclusion and the Origins of American Counterterrorism, and you'll see why shortly. So this project is part of my dissertation research. It started out of a more basic concern with the intersection of violence with social and political change. And I would also describe this as my more general area of research. To that end, I've completed 2 other projects recently. One is about interstitial rules in counterterrorism and the complexities of international law given the contestation over whether counterterrorism should be considered part of the war paradigm versus the law enforcement paradigm. And that'll be coming out in Global Constitutionalism this summer. And the other project is a co-authored book chapter on counterterrorism in Indonesia in the post-colonial context, and that would be part of a collected volume that's coming out next year titled Non-Western Responses to Terrorism. The research I'm presenting here today sits within multiple parts of the political science discipline. So one contribution I hope to make is to put some of these parts in conversation with one another. This includes primarily American politics, especially a historically oriented literature titled American Political Development, and also international relations, especially the subfield of international security studies. American political development doesn't have a lot of research on the development of American national security, and international security studies doesn't have a lot of research looking in depth into the development of security institutions within the state. And so by bringing these 2 parts of the discipline together, I hope to do both of those things. Today I want to start with what will at first seem like a fairly random historical comparison of 2 individuals. But I argue that the state's treatment of these individuals typifies how America approaches counterterrorism. So the first is Emma Goldman. Emma Goldman was an anarchist writer and philosopher who was widely known as a highly influential figure in the American anarchist movement and free love feminist movement from the late 1800s until the early 1900s. I say highly influential figure rather than leader because, of course, anarchist ideology rejects leadership. Anarchism, which came in many forms, including anarchical individualism, syndicalism, anarchical communism, and more, was a political ideology premised on the fundamental injustice of governing institutions. Its proponents believe that the state, capitalism, corporations, and religious institutions formed a nexus of social and political control that marginalized the individual, particularly poor individuals, right, affiliated with the labor movement. The various forms of anarchism disagreed about what should be put in place of those institutions, but one area of agreement among them was that the worker or laborer should be given greater influence and control over their own lives. So Goldman, as I said, was highly influential in this movement. She would give lectures that attracted large crowds. She regularly published in the leftist publication Mother Earth, and she helped to organize numerous strikes and other demonstrations. But Goldman was also frequently imprisoned for her advocacy, including a 2-year prison term for her role in protesting the draft during World War I, a time where free speech was restricted based on sedition laws, and a time which saw Goldman and many others deported to Russia after her prison sentence because of her affiliation with anarchism and her opposition to the draft. Al-Awlaki, like Goldman, was also a highly influential speaker and was reportedly affiliated with Al-Qaeda. He was an imam in the US, UK, and Yemen, a leader in the Muslim community, but with ties to radical Islam. So here we have two leaders influential within their respective communities who were considered radical by US officials, neither of whom were accused of actually committing acts of violence themselves, but were associated with ideologies and groups linked to violence. And significantly, both of these individuals were US citizens. Granted, citizenship was a more contested category in Goldman's era, when birthright citizenship and naturalization were significant legislative debates, but nonetheless, both were citizens. However, through their affiliation with radical ideologies, both of these individuals were treated as non-citizens by the government. Goldman, along with hundreds of other immigrants, was deported to Russia through laws prohibiting anarchist speech and affiliation, and Al-Awlaki was killed by a US drone strike in the context of the War on Terror, based on reports that he was a recruiter and motivator for Al-Qaeda. Al-Awlaki wasn't the only one, of course. There was also Hamdi, and as a legal scholar has said, citizens, as Hamdi was, may be transformed into foreigners in order to be ostracized and banished. So here we have two US citizens who, nearly 100 years apart, saw this status curtailed in the context of anti-radical state measures. So today I'm going to argue that both of these individuals were the target of a logic of exclusion that guided the formation of institutional, legal, and policy choices during Goldman's time, a time when the US was beginning to craft federal, domestic, and international security measures in response to political violence and terrorism, and that has remained the pervasive logic in US national security since. From the restriction and deportation of certain types of immigrants in the early 1900s, to the exclusion of communists in the mid-1900s, to Japanese internment in World War II, to the Anti-Terrorist Act of 1996, to detainment and targeted killing in the War on Terror today. In each of these cases, immigrants became the target of government actions that infringed on what would otherwise be basic rights of citizens. And Goldman and Al-Awlaki demonstrate the notion that some individuals can be stripped of their citizenship in order to be treated like aliens. So here's a rundown for the rest of my talk. I'll give an overview of my argument, followed by a brief discussion of the theoretical ideas and methods I employ in my research. And then I'll give an account of the historical period I'm concerned with here, focusing on events that demonstrate the logic of exclusion and its institutionalization in laws, policies, and organizations that together constitute the origins of American counterterrorism. So this analysis of Goldman and Al-Awlaki fit within a larger set of questions. These are, what are threats? What is the process by which someone or some group becomes known as a threat? And once that source of insecurity is widely recognized, how do particular security responses become the dominant frame and become new laws, policies, or institutional changes? Combining these questions, how can we understand the social and political processes behind insecurity and security? And more specifically, how can we understand these processes in the US historical context? in the development of the threats emanating from the Ku Klux Klan, the Irish American Fenians, and the Anarchists, and also in how the state eventually decided to respond to these different threats. Again, the answer that I hope to give is the following: that the processes of insecurity and security are conditioned together by ideas widely held and influential among state and societal elites, and by the relationship those ideas have to social and political institutions. As institutions become both the embodiment of ideas put into practice and a source for the sedimentation, the codification of those ideas into law or policy. In particular, the historical period I talk about today highlights the prevalence of what I call exclusionary institutional orders, building on Desmond King and Roger Smith's racial institutional orders. These are orders that combine widely held ideas based on identity, politics, and American society, along with institutional arrangements that enshrine, protect, and empower those ideas. In particular, I focus on exclusionary ideas such as American nativism, xenophobia, racism, or white supremacy, and how these exclusionary ideas shaped who or what would be grouped together as a threat, informed the creation of new policies, particularly immigration laws designed to keep out certain types of immigrants, and became sedimented as fixtures of American politics through their enactment and policy. So now I'll go into a bit more detail about these theoretical arguments. So this project seeks to explain a process with two halves, insecurity and security. The first objective of this research is to better understand the process by which something or someone becomes known as a threat or as a source of insecurity. This is the process I title threat development. Understanding threats constitutes a core concern for much that occurs in the study and practice of security, but it remains unclear how much we actually know about them. As Barry Buzan noted in his book, People, States, and Fear, a widely influential book in security studies, while we may think of threats in terms of their sector, as in military, economic, and so on, their source, intensity, and ability to change over time, at the end of the day, the complexity and malleability of threats still makes them ambiguous at best and a source of political posturing at worst. So Buzan wrote this in the early 90s, and while his basic argument still applies, I argue that two general approaches to threats have become influential in the field of security studies since then: threat perceptions and threat constructions. These two approaches carry with them particular assumptions. If a threat is perceived, that means that it exists independent of the observer. The observer acts as an assessor of an objectively existing threat. If a threat is constructed, that means it is dependent on the observer's perspective. The observer acts as an interpreter and in so doing constructs the threat. So threats can be conceived of as either objective facts external to individuals that are part of reality, or subjective or intersubjective interpretations of that reality. And this distinction is important because if threats are interpreted, that means that when something is deemed threatening, that judgment doesn't necessarily have to match an otherwise objective or neutral assessment of that thing. So objectively threatening things can be ignored or as interpreted as harmless, and objectively harmless things can be perceived as threats. And this in the literature on security studies is known as threat deflation or threat inflation. Most commonly, this literature is known for its critique of the Iraq War, where many authors argued that the Iraq War was a response to an inflated sense of the threat. But a common criticism of this literature and of the notion that the state might be reacting to an inflated threat from Saddam Hussein, from terrorism or otherwise, is that it does not explain how to measure the extent to which a threat is inflated. How do we know when something is inflated? So here I put forth both a process of development and a qualitative metric for assessing threat inflation. These are discursive association, or the process whereby groups or individuals are associated with a given threat, and clusivity, a term from linguistics, which refers to the language practice of establishing who or what is inside or outside of a group. As I'll show later, I argue that the US developed broad constructions of threat as represented by encompassing categorical labels, including Reds or radicals, or the Red Menace, or even terrorists, and that these large categories became so through repeated discursive associations where anarchists, socialists, communists, labor groups, feminists, European immigrants, particularly those from Southern and Eastern Europe, were grouped together by state and societal elites and described as representing a single, all-encompassing red or radical threat. Based on this, we could say that we can measure threat inflation by assessing degrees of inclusivity from narrow to moderate to broadly defined threats. So this brings me to the second half of my argument, how the state responds to those threats and attempts to eliminate insecurity or the security response. There are three overall narratives explaining the process of security that I consider: the marketplace of ideas, path dependency, and exclusionary institutional orders. The first of these, the marketplace of ideas, is an idea common to the literature on threat inflation. This is the notion that the polity has multiple competing sources of information, the government, the media, academics, and so on, and that this competition needs only the most accurate or factual information to prevail in public discourse. In security, this would lead to the assumption that the way we respond to insecurity is rational, efficient, and based on an approximation of a real or objective threat. The second is path dependency. This is a theoretical argument that is common to historical institutional studies in political science and is represented in Immigration by parts of the work of Dan Tickner. The basic idea here is that security responses will be heavily influenced by previously made decisions or paths. In this view, change or movement away from the path is dependent on significant moments, referred to as critical junctures. Finally, the last narrative, and the one that I put forth for the security response, is again exclusionary institutional orders. So, as I mentioned, this comes from an argument made by Desmond King and Roger Smith. And basically what they say is that change in American politics over time can be best explained as being the product of competing racial institutional orders, an emancipatory order based on racial equality versus a white supremacist order based on racial inequality. And so I build on Smith's, or this builds on Smith's other work based upon multiple traditions in American politics, right? As opposed to a single unified Americanist tradition of politics. And I take their argument and build on it further by identifying a more general pattern of exclusion founded on racial, ethnic, nativist, religious, or ideological differences. Together, these three theoretical areas can then be summarized as inferring different logics guiding security responses: a logic of pluralism, a logic of precedent, and a logic of exclusion. Okay, now the next slide may or may not be readable. Yeah. So it looks somewhat legible on my smaller computer screen, but it's pretty blurry here, so I apologize for that. I'll explain this really complicated graph in a minute. It's more supposed to be demonstrative than, providing necessary factual information. So combining the two halves of the process of insecurity and security, my argument is that state officials and societal elites constructed a broad interpretation of the threat of anarchist terrorism in the period from 1865 to 1925 and reacted to that broad, inflated view of the threat with institutional changes, laws, and policies designed to remove that threat by excluding individuals who are believed to be associated with it. This included immigration restrictions, the growth of federal investigatory and surveillance powers, increased federal resources and manpower for domestic security, and restrictions on speech and association. So before moving on to a discussion of this history, I'll briefly explain how I conducted the analysis, which is still ongoing, right? I have not finished the analysis yet. What is important in this theory is how different groups that used violence were framed in specific ways by state and societal elites. Elites drew on and contributed to discourses or ways of framing or of speaking and communicating about these groups. So with support from the Andrew Berlin Fund, I collected historical documents in the National Archives located in College Park, Maryland, in Washington, D.C., and the Library of Congress. I also draw from a number of online sources, including ProQuest Congressional, the American Catholic History Research Center online archives, the Haymarket Affair digital collection, the Bureau of Investigation files on fold3.com, LexisNexis Academic for court cases, and an online source titled the Anarchy Archives, and also the Miller Center Presidential Speech Archives. I then analyzed these documents looking for what policymakers said about these purportedly threatening groups during this time period. And this entailed coding these documents based upon how particular threats were characterized, what groups, events, or ideas were being associated with each other or with threats, in what context or contexts they were being related to, and so on. So for this coding, I used Atlas TI for PDF documents. And the picture you see here is what is called a network view of my coding scheme for half of the theoretical process that I explained a moment ago, the process of threat development. So you probably can't read this, but the top code there says threat development. And then there are main central nodes coming off of that, threat assessment, threat indicators, the threat groups, and counter discourses, right? And so these are different types of codes or frames that I identify in speech, and then use these to eventually determine what groups are being associated with the anarchists, what groups are being associated with threats more often, and so on, right? So eventually I'll be able to ask Atlas TI, how many times did I code threat assessment along with anarchists? How often did I code anarchists and threat assessment along with immigrants or a particular type of nationality, which is this column here? And obviously I don't have these results yet since I've not finished my research. So now I'd like to move on to a discussion of this history. So to begin, in the 1800s, the US is witness to political violence from three distinct groups: the KKK, the Irish American Fenians, and the Anarchists. So the violence of the KKK, comes at the end of the Civil War, obviously, when Klan members sought to prevent individuals, primarily black individuals, but also some Jewish individuals, from exercising their right to vote in particular previously Confederate states, right? Particularly South Carolina. And so since most of those individuals were going to vote for the Republican Party, groups that were primarily made up of white supremacist Democrats at the time then used violence to coerce those individuals not to engage in the political process. And then the government responded to the KKK with very targeted military, very targeted armed forces response, right? Only in South Carolina. And then also with legislation called the Enforcement Acts, which were meant to ensure that the new constitutional amendments were being protected in these areas. The Irish American Fenians, including the Irish Republican Brotherhood and the Clan na Gael, were groups that were based in the eastern United States that drew financial support and manpower from the United States, but supported the independence of Ireland and carried out bomb attacks and dynamiting attacks in London, right, in England. And this was primarily in the 1880s, right? And there's also a moment where the Fenians attempted to invade Canada from the United States in the 1860s. And so the United States responded there, but in the dynamite campaign, the US did very little, right? It mostly ignores calls from England to put a stop to these groups, basically. Right, so together, these two groups are important for two reasons. First, state responses to the KKK and Fenians demonstrate the lack of federal investigatory, surveillance, and other domestic security powers during this time period outside of the armed forces. In the 1800s, federal powers in these areas were extremely limited. The only federal investigatory agents that the federal government had were the Secret Service, which was created primarily to monitor counterfeiting, and the Military Intelligence Division. All other investigatory and surveillance powers were decentralized at the state and local level. The second reason these two groups are important is the state's reaction to them. right, and how different it was from its later reaction to the anarchists, particularly during the Palmer raids. Right, so the government's response to these two groups demonstrated a fair amount of restraint, whereas with the anarchists it didn't. Right, we have in the Palmer raids expansive arrests and deportations of European immigrants. So we have to ask, how was this decision arrived at? What led to such an expansive reaction against the anarchists and associated groups? And this story really begins at the Chicago Haymarket in 1886, in what is now referred to as the Haymarket Affair or the Haymarket Tragedy. So the Haymarket Affair began on May 4th, 1886, as a peaceful assembly of labor activists, anarchists, and socialists. However, after the arrival of the Chicago police, it ended with a bomb being tossed into the crowd in the direction of the police. And 7 police officers and 4 civilians were killed, and the bomb thrower was never conclusively identified. 6 years later, in the only other act of anarchist violence in the US in the 1800s, Alexander Berkman, a Russian immigrant, repeatedly shot and stabbed a manager for Carnegie Steel named Henry Clay Frick, though Frick survived. And responses to these events led to some of the first linkages of anarchists to other social groups and violence. In an analysis of the Haymarket Affair written in 1889, an author, a historian named Shack, linked communist Russian assassins, dynamiters, and labor agitators with the Chicago anarchists. So the Haymarket Affair begins the process I call discursive association. The response to this event in the news media and government and so on begins to link anarchism and violence to the workers' rights movement, to labor, to other ideologies like communism, to particular nationalities like Russians, to immigrants from Europe in general, and so on. And these connections proved problematic for these groups. Ordinary trade unionists, for example, found themselves in an increasingly hostile environment as anger over the Haymarket Affair gave anti-union employers and officials a way to brand all labor activists as violent subversives. Likewise, these earlier experiences with anarchist violence also produced some of the first attempts at adding anarchists to the list of proscribed classes of immigration in the 1880s and 1890s. Anarchist actions in Europe and particular versions of their philosophy also helped to strengthen these negative opinions of them. Right, so the doctrine was put into practice in Europe that in order to implement political change, you had to use direct action or propaganda of the deed. Right, so this was a philosophy among some anarchists that only violence could lead to the types of changes that they desired. And in Europe, this led to the assassination of heads of state or at least attempted assassinations, though many of these were successful, in Germany, Italy, Russia, France, Spain, and Austria, and also killed up to 40 people in bombings in Paris, Barcelona, and St. Petersburg. So meanwhile, in the US, the anarchists avoided high-profile acts of violence, at least after the attack on Henry Clay Frick in 1892. But this changed when President McKinley was shot by Leon Czolgosz in Buffalo, New York, on September 6, 1901. So this was the day after McKinley had given a speech at the Pan American Exposition, and Czolgosz had waited for hours to meet the president during a public reception that had been advertised in the newspapers. And holding a short-barreled revolver in his right hand wrapped in a handkerchief, Czolgosz passed by exposition guards, 10 Marines, and 3 Secret Service agents to shoot McKinley twice in the back. McKinley survived for a few days, but then died due to shock and heart failure on September 14th. Czolgosz was a self-proclaimed anarchist, but his real ties to other anarchists were unclear. It was uncovered that he had attended one of Emma Goldman's lectures, that he had read anarchist publications such as Free Society, and that he had frequented a club in Cleveland where he said he met other anarchists. Czolgosz's citizenship was also in dispute, demonstrating the lingering controversy over birthright citizenship, which had recently been enacted in the 14th Amendment. So though he was a natural-born American under the law, state officials stripped Czolgosz of his American identity in their descriptions of him and of his attack on the president. So, for example, in a speech during deliberations over a new bill for presidential protection, Representative Hamilton stated that Czolgosz was the emotional and unreasonable result of hereditary hatred of old world government oppression, and that in his blood runs the transmitted horror of Siberia, the hatred of the government of which Siberia is a part, and the inherited memory of the Polish national extinction, right? So very distinct language used to describe Eastern Europeans, right? And this is from the congressional record, right? So stated on the congressional floor. And according to Hamilton, this heredity meant that for anarchists, our language is unknown to them, our institutions are unknown to them, free speech, free press, personal liberty are at first incomprehensible to them. Given this, Hamilton concluded that anarchy here is in no sense the product of American conditions, but a growth transplanted from abroad. So these depictions of Czolgosz, which drew from pre-existing perspectives on anarchism that had carried over from the recent Haymarket affair, became highly significant once Congress reconvened, tasked with the need for a response to McKinley's assassination. And this response was twofold. First, Congress passed a bill making the death penalty the punishment for threats or injuries to the president or vice president's well-being. Second, the Congress passed expansive and restrictive immigration legislation in 1903. President Roosevelt's address to Congress following McKinley's assassination initiated discussion of immigration restrictions. And he drew on the disputed citizenship of Czolgosz and the perceived foreignness of the anarchist terrorist to argue that all anarchists should be kept out of the country, deported if they're already here, and punished if they refuse to leave. In President Roosevelt's and Representative Hamilton's remarks, we see the impact of exclusionary institutional orders, the logic of exclusion, and the continued association of anarchist violence with increasingly general social and political groups, such as immigrants from Europe, generally speaking. So the response to McKinley's assassination both drew from and strengthened nativist and xenophobic sentiments, and in so doing sought to rationalize the logic of excluding an entire ideology from American society and politics. Because the threat of anarchist violence had been associated with all anarchists, and because anarchism had been associated with immigrants from the European Old World, the belief that in order to restore security, all immigrants had to be vetted for unsavory ideological beliefs, and all anarchists had to be excluded from American society became dominant. And this logic then became further substantiated through the passage of immigration restrictions in 1903 and would remain influential for the next decades. Okay, so now, because of the constraints of time, I can't go through this entire history in great detail. So I'll just list briefly some of the things that happened between McKinley's assassination in 1901 and the passage of immigration laws in 1903. And then I'll talk a little bit about the Palmer raids in 1920, which I argue are really the moment when we see threat inflation and action on threat inflation. So some of the things that happen in between these 2 points, first, a number of additional acts of violence, right? Bombings of the Los Angeles Times building, assassination of former governor of Idaho, Frank Steunenberg, right, who opposed labor activism in Idaho, an attempt on former President Roosevelt's life, and so on, right? Also a number of local demonstrations, bombings in New York, and more, right? We also see a lot of security developments in this period, the most notable of which was the creation of the Bureau of Investigation in the Justice Department in 1908. And this really comes more through bureaucratic disputes rather than a response to this history. Congress had said that no one could use Secret Service agents other than the Treasury Department. And then in response, President Roosevelt said, well, then we need to have agents particular to the Department of Justice for anti-radical measures. And that then led to the creation of the Bureau of Investigation, which of course becomes the primary actor in the Palmer raids. So the next major thing that happens is World War I. And in World War I, the US government gets basically a stamp of approval for any anti-radical measure that they decide to take. There's a law on sedition, espionage, additional immigration restrictions, and all of these laws serve to allow the government additional leeway in arresting and deporting suspected radicals. And in order to do this, they needed a larger bureaucratic security administration. And they get that in the Bureau of Investigation. So part of that is then the effort to find and make an index of all individuals suspected of being radicals during this period, which, as it happens, was overseen by J. Edgar Hoover, right, who is future head of the FBI. So this is part of the index that I photographed in the archives. And you can't see it, but the one tab here is the letter B, right? So this is just the file for the alphabet parts A and B, right? So this is a huge index that Hoover and his associates built. Right, and then, so in the context of the war, we have this anti-radical sentiment, right, that's being built upon, that's leading to increased associations of anarchists, communists, and other suspected radicals, including labor groups like the Industrial Workers of the World. And all of these groups together are being reacted to in basically the same way by the government. And the peak of that reaction is really the Palmer raids in late 1919, early 1920. So the context of the Palmer raids starts in summer of 1919, when a number of bombs were sent through the mail, targeting mostly government officials, including one that was sent to the Attorney General's office, the Attorney General's home, who at the time was Mitchell Palmer, right? Hence the Palmer raids. So partly in response to the mail bomb plots, partly in response to all of the other currents going on in the war and post-war periods, Palmer, in conjunction with officials at the Bureau of Immigration, go on nationwide raids, rounding up, arresting, and initiating deportation proceedings against a number of European immigrants suspected of having radical ties. Right, so primarily immigrants, because since this was the post-war period, the sedition and espionage and other laws were no longer able to be applied to citizens, right? That was only a wartime necessity. But immigrants did not have the same protections. So we had raids of meeting places that were supposedly conducted without deference to law, without warrants, and were described as being particularly brutal and leading to individuals being put in jail cells in confining and uncomfortable conditions, separated from their families, many of whom were then deported. Right? It was about 800 suspected radicals in Detroit alone that were arrested, right, and held in jail, and there were thousands of these individuals across the country. So the Palmer raids, I argue, are an example of threat inflation. Again, a common point of contention in the literature on threat inflation is the question as to how exactly we know the threat has been inflated. So I base this claim on the ideas of discursive association and inclusivity. I say that the Palmer raids were a security response to a highly inclusive conception of the threat, right, or a broad conception of the threat. And this broad conception is typified by encompassing categories of threat used by state officials, including categories like Reds or enemy aliens or radicals or the Red Menace. And these inclusive categories included, again, not only anarchists, but also socialists, right, who had been otherwise a legitimate political party that had fielded a presidential candidate in Eugene Debs, communists and Bolsheviks, feminists, and labor agitators. The social and political groups associated with the threat were then, in multiple senses, excluded from American society and politics. They were excluded from legal protections as they were placed in the radical category, and then which then stripped them of their right to stay in America. Right, so they were quite literally excluded by them being deported from the country. So, channeled by exclusionary institutional orders, based in conceptions of American nativism and racism, these groups were also referred to in highly racial or ethnic overtones. So, for example, around the time of the Palmer raids, we also had the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, right, which is the picture from the flyer. And there, the prosecution at the trial described the perpetrator of the crime as some kind of foreigner who was dark-complexioned, swarthy like an Italian, and could be recognized as a foreigner even by the way he ran, right? So highly racial and ethnic overtones. The final act of violence associated with the anarchists happened in 1920, months after the Palmer raids, when a wagon exploded in the financial district of New York City, killing 38 and injuring 143 others. So while the Palmer raids would become the object of congressional hearings concerning their legality in 1922, the growth of the Bureau of Investigation, the establishment of immigration restrictions on ideological grounds, and the idea of the red threat would all be firmly ingrained in the American mind, right? So even though this marks the end of anarchist violence, the institutional reaction of the state carried over. Okay, so just to conclude, I have a broad overview of my talk here, which I'll leave up as I take questions. And I'll just end by saying what this history tells us is both something about where American national security today comes from, and also something about how American politics and society help to develop who or what we perceive as threats. So this period really shows us the development of the federal national security apparatus, particularly through the use of immigration restrictions to control who would be a part of the American polity and what ideas or behaviors they would bring with them, but also through the development of surveillance and investigatory organizations. But it also shows us how this security apparatus is tied to the logic of exclusion. And we see this again in Japanese internment, in McCarthyism, in the 1996 anti-terrorism law, which continued to allow the removal or exclusion of aliens, but now under the term of terrorists rather than radicals, and in the detainment and targeted killing of individuals in the war on terror. So together, the biases that I say were part of the process of discursive association fueled the nativist Anglo-Saxon supremacist vision of an exclusionary institutional order, which through repeated acts of Congress and actions of the bureaucracy empowered this logic of exclusion that has then remained prevalent in American national security ever since. That's it. Thank you. Any questions? Tim?
First, thanks, Mike. This is really interesting. It gets more interesting every time I hear about it.
Thanks.
So I was struck by something you said right at the outset, representing your two cases of sort of interesting examples of threat development in American politics.
Mm-hmm.
And you described Goldman and Al-Awlaki as influential thinkers who are not directly linked to violence. It seems to me that this discursive association you're talking about directly leads to ideas of who counts as a justifiable target for responses to terror. So the discursive association links people together, and from there we say, even though these people aren't related to, aren't participating in violence, their ideological linkages set them apart as justifiable targets. that something that you see as reasonable?
Do I think it's reasonable?
This link that I'm suggesting.
Well, I think this kind of gets back to this critique of threat inflation, right? So people often ask, you know, how do we know if something's inflated or not? And then how do we know that without the particular response, right, whether we say it's inflated or otherwise, how do we know that without that response we wouldn't have seen more terrorism and more violence, right? So the question you're asking, is it reasonable, kind of relates to the question of if the government hadn't targeted these individuals, would they have maybe gone on to inspire further acts of violence, right? And you know, it's a counterfactual, basically, right? I can't say that yes they would have, or no they definitely wouldn't have, right? And somebody in the U.S. government would likely say, counterfactually speaking, we would assume that because they are supporting violent ideologies, that their presence in society would increase violence, right? But then critics, which there are many critics of the government's response here that I didn't really have time to get into, critics would say that no, these individuals are just public speakers, right? There's no direct incitement to violence by these particular individuals. Maybe less so with Goldman compared to Logic, right? So do I personally think that it's reasonable? I don't. You know, I don't really have an opinion.
Yeah.
Insofar as that, right?
I meant sort of theoretically reasonable rather than is the action taken reasonable.
Then did I still answer your question?
You did.
Okay, good. Perfect. Yeah.
I don't want to take up the Q&A space with students who have questions first. Okay. So I mean, I have a range of things to say or ask about, and I think it's not a bad point of entry to where Sam began. And I guess there are a couple of themes of my questions. One is how, from a kind of scholarly perspective, do you establish a fact basis beneath some of your claims so that your work and your argument and your overarching thesis is credible? So just start there, first of all. Second of all, if we're going to talk about inclusivity in terms of discourse analysis, especially as a metric, right, as a way of measuring threat inflation or, in some cases, threat deflation, which is something that I don't think we really deal with, threat deflation. There's lots of incidents in U.S. history, especially in this period, where various constituencies and members of the public were critical of the U.S. not taking their local governments, their municipal governments, their federal government for not taking a strong enough role in what were obviously issues, security issues being raised in many instances. Now, this is a classic critique of 9/11, right? Failure to connect the dots, or some of the post 9/11 incidents where federal bureaucracies weren't talking to each other, etc. So, I mean, the kind of counterfactual to this notion of threat inflation is threat deflation in a way that, if your metric is truly neutral, must have something to say about it. Yeah, right? So I guess my question about the metric is, how do you actually establish a baseline to talk about discursive notions of threat? Because, I mean, the whole premise of a discourse analysis that works on the basis of association is that there isn't a baseline. There isn't a fact pattern. There isn't a reality that you're judging off of to try to get a sense of what's happening truly. Right? It's just kind of, so it's almost like a viral spread mark. However many times these things are linked together, that constitutes inflation. But maybe that's not inflation. Maybe that's a discursive phenomenon or a viral spread of some kind. Right? I mean, to use kind of social media terms or whatever.
Yeah. So I forgot to bring a pen, but I think I'm remembering all of your questions. The first is about the factual basis of the claims. The second is discursive association. And then the third is, the second was threat deflation, and the third was discursive association. So the factual basis of the claim, and I think this is tied into then the question you're asking at the end about discursive association, right? So there isn't necessarily an objective measure that I can go and find and say this was the actual threat posed by these groups. And I think that's the problem that you're identifying, right? How do I say that it was an inflated threat without having that objective measure? And it's hard to get that because
what's wrong with violence?
Well, the acts of violence do help to contextualize all this, right? If I was doing like a traditional security studies measurement of the threat, I would want maybe the number of individuals associated with the group, the amount of them that actually subscribe to violence, and so on. But since anarchism is an explicitly leaderless and institutionless enterprise, they didn't keep this kind of information, right? So I have to mostly go off of what I see in the government and media documents, which are the same documents that I argue are involved in inflating the threat. So what I'm trying to say here is that we can reconceptualize threat inflation not based upon a comparison of objectivity to subjectivity, but a basis of comparison on a single group being identified as the perpetrators of violence versus increasing numbers of additional groups being associated with a single act of violence. So the Bureau of Investigation believes that, for example, the mail bomb plot was in the act of the Guyanese anarchist group, right, which was a set of about 24 individuals in New York City in 1919. However, the government's response is not just to the Guyanese anarchists, but all anarchists, individuals who subscribe to socialism and Bolshevism and are part of the rank and file of union groups and so on, right? So the argument I'm making is that it's about the size of the group that the government is conceptualizing as being the threat. And I know that's not entirely satisfying. It's not entirely satisfying to me, but it's what I've come up with to overcome this lack of objective data.
Do you have evidence for that? Like, for instance, okay, size of the group, etc., but is there evidence that some of these other associative organizations or members of groups are actually playing a role in organization planning or advocacy of violence? And if there is, then how is that inflation as opposed to description?
Well, there's no evidence that they were involved with the mail bomb plots or the bombing of Wall Street or these other acts that were supposedly part of the anarchists. They were involved in workers' strikes, particularly during World War I, when the government was particularly concerned to make sure the manufacturing of war resources was going without interruption, right? So they were associated with what the government saw as being violent demonstrations, but not violent demonstrations that were led by the same individuals responsible for bombing attacks, right? So it's about how the government conceptualized an encompassing category, the red threat, and then said that these otherwise disparate demonstrations or acts of violence were all part of the same threat. And so I'm saying that discursive characterization of those two things, that is the discursive association that enabled this broad response. And the evidence then is in the documents that I'm reading, right? So.
I was curious, you've obviously gone through a lot of government documentation. Has there been any indication that this was intentional?
On the part of the government?
As in an intent to inflate several groups, one of which might be violent, in order to bring the same level of response against all groups?
I think that there's a mixture of intention and kind of just influenced by prevailing ideas, right? So certainly the Bureau of Investigation had a desire to expand their mandate, right? To call for increasing amounts of resources from Congress to increase the size of their organization. And in order to do that, they needed to present a credible threat that required these resources. But at the same time, we can say that the only reason why that was successful is because people actually believed that there was this threat, right? And the reason I'm arguing that they believed there was this threat was because of the ideas about these groups that had been built up from the Haymarket Affair in 1886, suggesting that anarchists, socialists, communists, even feminists were actually a radical threat to the country. Right? So I think it's a mixture of intentional actions on the part of individuals, along with the ideas that they act upon and also reinforce in their actions. Sam?
Throw out a comment. It sounds to me like what you're describing just now speaks to social movement theory literature. It suggests that strategic framing influences ideology in the future, which I think is a very interesting idea. And not knowing that much about the literature, I'm not aware of anyone who's talked about that linkage. There are people who distinguish ideology from framing, but the tie between the two is, I'm not aware of people discussing it. And I think that's an interesting place that your research could go.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I do have to be cautious with the amount of literatures I'm drawing on because I'm already basically reading a history of American immigration legislation, American security policies, and then the theoretical literature on American political development, and then security studies and IR, right? So there's a lot going on already. But I think you're right that social movement theory could be another useful addition. Yeah.
So you sort of showed or argue that your explanation is different from African.
Mm-hmm.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because
Yes.
it seems that it's very similar, right? The way how over time institutions get established and then deviating sort of from that path becomes more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Institution already in place. So
Yeah. Actually, I had intended to comment on that, but I was running out of time and my voice, so I cut that at the last minute. But first, I would say that I'm still making up my mind exactly how much or how little path dependency matters. I don't think that it's entirely incorrect in parts of this, right? There are certainly vested interests and pre-existing institutional choices that matter here. But I think that exclusionary institutional orders matter more, and here's why. So with path dependency, the main explanatory logic is the inertia built up by the institution, right? That inertia within the institution is what drives particular actions or outcomes. For exclusionary institutional orders, it's a combination of empowerment through institutions and ideas that then shape how institutions are being used or made sense of or changed, right? And so for me, I think that it's a combination of ideas that we can identify in the discourse of state policymakers, as well as the institutional choices they make and how those institutions empower those ideas into the future, but also rely on those ideas in order to have content, right? In order to have the influence that they do.
Sure, I think we have time for one last question. Is there anything you didn't get a chance to say that you would like to tell us?
No, I summarized most of the main points. Yeah, I just skipped over some details that would flesh some things out. But.
I actually have one short question.
Sure.
Sorry, jumping at the last second. How far forward does your project go? Do you stop with the Red Scare McCarthy, or are you going all the way up to the War on Terror?
Well, what I'll do is the detailed parts of the project will go until 1925, which is a somewhat arbitrarily chosen date, and I might move it to 26, which is when Sacco and Vanzetti were executed. But basically, in the mid-20s, the Wall Street bombing investigation just kind of dies out, right? They never really figure out who did it. And so I was going to have it be the project ends with the end of the investigation. And then as I was reading, I realized that, the investigation never formally ends because to this day, they don't really know who did it, right? One historian thinks that it was a friend of Sacco and Vanzetti, this guy named Mario Buda, that did it, but, we don't know for sure. And then after 1925, I'll have, in my conclusion, a discussion of continuity and discontinuity since then until present day that will be much more brief in the amount of detail it goes into.
But you have to go to Sacco and Vanzetti because we have the mural, and that's going to be the cover of your book.
Well, certainly Sacco and Vanzetti are going to be in the chapter. It's just whether or not I talk about their execution and use that as my, the period at the end of the sentence or not.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.